going to be in Exodus chapter 21, verse 1 through 23, verse 9. It's going to be a lot of text. In fact, this is not a passage that I have ever heard preached before. It's one that I think often people might choose to skim over or honestly try to get out of teaching. It's got some tricky stuff in there. But this week as I've been in it, it's been really exciting to see God's character, to see his beauty, his goodness, who he is. A couple weeks ago, Pastor Mark was preaching on the Ten Commandments, and he talked about that third commandment, not taking the Lord's name in vain. And I know growing up, whenever I heard people talk about not taking the Lord's name in vain, I really thought typically they just explained it as not using God or Jesus Christ as profanity, right? Not using the Lord's name in such a demeaning and little way as to use it as a swear word. And I think that's absolutely true. We should not disrespect God in that way by taking his name in that manner. But what Pastor Mark said and what I think is true is that it's actually much deeper than that. There's actually a much more significant meaning to this idea of taking the Lord's name in vain. See, growing up, whenever I would leave the house, or often when I would leave the house and I'd be going someplace without my parents, my dad would say to me, "Remember whose last name you have," before I left the house. He would remind me that I was his son and we shared the same last name, and therefore anything I did would be associated not just with him, but the rest of my family. Right? If I went out and I acted a fool, people would think that my family was foolish. If I went out and I was courteous and well-behaved, people would think that my parents were doing a great job. Right? There was this reputation at stake when me, with the last name Walker, went out and lived my life. And I think when we think about the Israelites taking the name of the Lord in vain, really it's this question of how will their conduct reflect on the God that they serve? Will the nations look at them and say, they serve a God who is foolish or cruel or deceitful or absent? Or will they look at the lives of God's people and say, their God is good, faithful, just? See, I think the conduct of God's people, the way we live our lives, should reflect his character. Right? We should live our lives in a way that is a good testimony to the character of God, that is like his for the world to see. We should love the things that he loves. We should hate the things that we hate. We should work for his mission, reflect his character. And in tonight's passage, we're going to see this collection of laws, of instructions that God gave to the Israelites when Moses was up on Mount Sinai that would help them reflect his character in the land he was sending them to. That would help him live like the type of people he was calling them to be, teaching them to be the people of God. So we're going to be, like I said, in Exodus chapter 21 to 23, verse 9, looking at some of the laws that God gave Moses when he went up to Mount Sinai. We've been talking the past couple of weeks about this crazy Sinai experience that they had when the nation gathered at the foot of this mountain and they saw smoke and fire and thunder, and it was so great. Last week, Pastor Mark talked about how they said to Moses, "Please ask God not to talk to us anymore. We can't handle it. You go up and intercede for us." And so Moses goes up to intercede at the top of the mountain. He speaks to God, and God gives him a list of commands for the people. Now we see in this section 43 instructions, and some scholars think, and I'm with them, that this is probably not a comprehensive legal code, probably not all of the commands they were given, but a representative sample of the types of laws that they had to govern their society. It shows what types of things were expected of the people of God in the land that he had promised them. So God has saved these people from slavery in Egypt. He has brought them to this mountain to meet him, and now will teach them what kind of people they are to be when they enter the land that he has promised. Let me pray, and then we'll get started. But before we do that, I'm not going to read every single law tonight. Usually we read the whole passage, but we'd be here till next week if I tried to do that. And honestly, we're not going to get to cover every single law. I would encourage you this week to read this passage yourself. And if you have questions, I'll give you Pastor Mark's phone number. Just kidding. You can reach out to me and I'd be happy to talk about it with you. But let me pray and then we'll jump right into it. Dear Lord, I am so thankful for this opportunity to teach your word. I'm so thankful for the gift that you have given us that is your word, that we can see who you are, come to know you, love and follow you better because of the gift of your word and the power of your spirit in our lives. I pray tonight that as we sit under it, as we read it and study from it, that you would make yourself known to us in a new way. I pray all these things in your son's name. Amen. So first I'm going to talk tonight about 5 different aspects of God's character that we see reflected in these rules. And I'm going to read excerpts from each of these sections. The first section is chapter 21, verses 1 to 11, and I'm going to read the first 7 verses as we learn about a God of liberation. Now, these are the rules that you shall set before them. When you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th year he shall go out free for nothing. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife, and she bears him sons or daughter, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. But if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free, then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore his ear through with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever. Now let's address the elephant in the room. I titled this section a God of Liberation, and the first thing I talked about were the rules for slavery in Israel. This passage kind of hit our ears rough, right? We have to ask this question, is the Bible supporting slavery? Is it pro-slavery? And we have this complicated history where people have used the Bible to, in fact, support slavery, particularly in America, where we saw the horrors of race-based chattel slavery play out for hundreds of years. Now, as we're talking about this, I think I need to start by saying that the purpose of the Bible is not to set right every social ill. It's not to set right every problem that we see in the world around us. Its purpose is to point to the person who will set right every problem that we see, right? So the Bible doesn't comprehensively condemn every flaw that we see in our society. It points to the one who will one day fix every flaw that we have in our society, who will one day set right every wickedness and evil and sin. The purpose of the Bible is to bear witness to Jesus Christ, that he is the Messiah who will end all injustice and bring peace to the world. But I think that the thrust of the Bible is towards liberation. I think that the rules that we see in this passage actually limit the evils of slavery and move closer to liberation. I think if you read a book like Philemon, you can't come away from it thinking that Paul was a big fan of slavery. At least you didn't read it closely, if that's what happens. In fact, if we look at our history if we look at the history of slavery in the West, that there actually was a version of the Bible created in the 1800s that was so highly edited, they took out 90% of the Old Testament and 50% of the New because they were worried it would make their slaves want freedom, right? The slave masters themselves thought the Bible is too for liberty, too for freedom for me to give it to my slaves. I have to get rid of the entirety of the Old Testament almost and most of the New. And so when you read these rules that we see here in Exodus 21, you actually see that they are surprisingly progressive for the ancient world, that they are, in fact, a great improvement on what was in the culture around them. We see laws that limit the duration and acquisition of slaves. In 21:1, we see this message that every slave will go free in the 7th year, that Hebrew slaves will be set free in the 7th year, that there is a limit to the period of their enslavement. No one was a slave forever. They received their freedom after 7 years. This is worlds different from what we saw in American history. In 21 verse 16, it talks about how the taking of slaves is criminalized. It says that you can't abduct or kidnap someone for the purpose of any purpose. Anyone who abducts someone or makes them a slave or is in possession of a captured person is given the death penalty in that verse. See, this cuts off the supply of slaves. It criminalizes profiting off of the slave trade. And this is another huge difference between this form of slavery than what we had here in America. And if you continue to read in chapter 21, you actually see these laws established that protect the dignity and the humanity of slaves. That the death penalty was given for killing a slave. If you killed a slave, he would be avenged. Same as any free person in the eyes of the law. They weren't animals who could be killed without consequence. There was no forced separation of families. We saw that in the section that I read, that if a slave was not married, his master couldn't force him to marry and would not separate him from his family if he did not choose at the end of his period of slavery, at the end of his 7 years. We see detailed later in this passage that women who are slaves would either be treated as daughters or mothers. They wouldn't be treated as the horrible ways that women have been treated who were enslaved. They would either be treated as daughters or mothers or given their freedom. Sorry, daughters or wives. Wrote my notes wrong. We also see that abused slaves are given their freedom in this passage, that if even a tooth is lost, they would be set free. So these are hard to read, and I don't want to pretend like I want to be a slave in ancient Israel. That's not the case at all. But I think we can see that God is limiting the evil of this practice. He is moving away from this idea of endless slavery to this period of everyone gets free in 7 years. See, it's a reflection of his heart for liberation, of his heart for the freedom of his people, that he works for their freedom. See, if we read Exodus, the beginning of the book, we see him rescue his people from slavery in Egypt, to make a plan for them to have freedom in the promised land. When the Israelites were slaves, they cried out to God and he delivered them. That's the whole story of Exodus, the plagues and all that stuff. He chose a family of slaves in Egypt to bring to freedom so they could serve him in the promised land. And we see this picture of God painted throughout the Old Testament, of him as a liberator who frees his people from their enemy oppression so that they can serve him time and time again when the enemies of God rise up and that the Philistines come in or whoever comes in to oppress the people of God, he liberates them. And what I think is so beautiful about these laws, these rules that we're talking about tonight, is that they're fulfilled in Jesus. See, Jesus is the fulfillment of these laws. In Matthew 17, it talks about how Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but rather to fulfill it. And he came to liberate us from slavery to sin and death, to bring a year of jubilee to us so that we could be free. Romans 6 talks about how apart from Christ, we are slaves to sin and death. We are unable to walk in obedience to God, destined to die in our sin, separated from him. But Jesus died in our place so that we could be freed from the power of sin and death to walk in new life. He is the ultimate fulfillment of these laws, bringing true liberty to God's people. Let's look at the next section. We're going to talk about how he is a God of life. We see this in verses 21, 12 to 32. I'm going to read 12 to 17. Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die. Whoever strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. So we see in this section God provide laws that protect life. He provides laws that ensure the life will continue. He makes these laws about murder and manslaughter. He actually establishes a difference between the two, right? If it's premeditated, if you planned it, there's one punishment. But if you did not plan it, there's another. He establishes laws about the rights of the unborn in this section as well, this punishment for if you attack a pregnant woman. He implements these penalties for actions that lead to death. We also see these laws about respecting your parents, and it kind of surprised me to see that in there because I don't typically think of that as so important, but over and over again, the Bible includes disrespecting or disobeying your parents in with like the worst of the worst sins. So kids in the room, remember that. I think we should take God seriously when he talks about stuff like this because he clearly takes it seriously. See, these laws that create penalties for murder and will provide a justice system to stop just wanton killing, they reflect how God values life. Right? When we read the Bible, we learn in Genesis that death is the tragic consequence of sin. That death enters the world because Adam and Eve chose sinful rebellion instead of obedience. And death quickly becomes the greatest enemy of humanity. It's the one thing we all have in common. Death, right? Doesn't matter if you're rich, doesn't matter if you're poor, doesn't matter if you're smart, if you're talented, if you're wicked, if you're good, death comes for all. Ecclesiastes is a great commentary on that if you're looking for a fun read. See, these laws show how God is opposed to and opposes death. He punishes those who either through bad intention or through carelessness cause the death of others. He establishes these laws that protect life and promote wise living. He's not apathetic towards the death of his people. He wants them to live long and full lives. And we see Jesus as the fulfillment of these same laws. See, Jesus came so that we could have eternal life. John 10:10, Jesus is talking about this thief that comes to steal and destroy, and he says this, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. That's why Jesus came, so that his people could have abundant life. He fulfills these laws by securing eternal life for all who trust in him. See, Jesus lived a perfect life without sin. And then he died a death he didn't deserve in our place on the cross, and was raised to new life by the power of God so that all who trust in him by faith can share in this resurrected life. We can have eternal life through faith in Jesus. And we see even more that Jesus will destroy death. 1 Corinthians 15:26 says this, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Paul is talking about this future day when Christ will finally bring an end to death. That great enemy that faces every person will be brought to an end. Jesus will return to judge the world and rescue his people, and in the end, it will be God's people dwelling with him in a land without death for eternity. So we should be a people who promote and protect life. Right? If this is God's character, we should reflect it. We should be like him, promoting and protecting life. You know, in our context, I think this means we need to be concerned with the gun violence in our city. We need to do what we can to bring it to an end. We need to care about the addiction crisis in our city. We need to do what we can to address problems like that. We need to work for the health and the safety of children and the unborn. We need to work against the things that lead to death in our city, because that is the character of God. And in everything, we need to point to the one who will one day defeat death. So we see that he's a God of liberation, he's a God of life, but we also see that he's a God of restoration. This is going to be covering verses 21:33 to 22:15. I'm going to read 22 verses 1 to 4. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If a thief is found breaking in and is struck so that he dies, there shall be no blood guilt for him. But if the sun has risen on him, there shall be blood guilt for him. He shall surely pay. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. If the stolen beast is found alive in his possession, whether it is an ox or a donkey or a sheep, he shall pay double. So in this section, we see these laws provided about the rules for making restitution. If you take something that's not yours, if you break something that belongs to somebody else, if you steal something or lose something or something like that, you have to pay back what was lost, damaged, or stolen. God commands those who steal or harm another's property to pay back, sometimes at an increased value, right? Not just what they took, but actually up to 5 times what they took. Even property damage from negligence is addressed in this section. We see the principles of this section lived out in the story of Zacchaeus. You know, the wee little man was he, climbed up in a sycamore tree. He was a tax collector who had this transformative experience of the mercy and grace of Jesus. And he had been cheating those who he collected taxes from. And then at the end of the story, he pays them back more than he took from them. See, the idea here is that God's people should restore what is lost or broken. They should restore what they have taken from others, what they have lost. God cares about restoring what is broken. This reflects his character of being that kind of God. Often when we think about justice, I think we think about punitive justice, right? The wicked getting what they deserve, the bad people being punished, right? A prison sentence or a fine or something like that, a punishment applied to the wicked. But there's this other aspect of justice that's restorative, right? That focuses on repairing the harm that was done to the person who was wronged, not just punishing the wicked. And we see that in this section. All of these instructions deal with restoring what was taken. I remember as a child, if one of my siblings broke a toy of mine, I didn't just want them to be punished. I did. Trust me, I did. But I wanted it to be replaced. I wanted it to be fixed. I wanted something fixed. That's this element of justice. And it's not just simple repayment in this case. Rather, it is a greater than repayment. It's restitution at a 5-to-1 rate. It's giving the best of their crops. That's how God's restoration works. He's not miserly when it comes to making all things new. See, God restores what is lost and he repairs what is broken. In the story of Job, we see Job lose everything. And it ends with Job getting more than he had in the first place. In the story of Joseph, we see Joseph sold as a slave to Egypt. And it ends with him being in that second position of power and authority right under Pharaoh. God takes the Israelites from slavery and death in Egypt and delivers them to the promised land, flowing with milk and honey. He restores what is broken. He pays back what is lost. And Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of this. He brings ultimate restoration. There are kinds of loss in this life that cannot be restored by human authorities. Right? Anyone who has lost a loved one to violence knows that no punishment of the guilty, no fine, no monetary repayment can undo the harm that was done. But Jesus can. John 13 is this story of Lazarus. He was a friend of Jesus who took ill and he died. And Jesus, a few days after getting the news, travels to the town where he died and greets his grieving sisters, who I'm sure had some comfort from Christ's presence, but could not see how they would get their brother back anytime soon. And yet Christ raised him from the dead. Jesus can repair what is broken, no matter how broken, no matter how lost. Christ can make all things new. And that's his plan. He's coming again to make all things new. Whatever you have lost or suffered, whatever has been destroyed or taken away, Jesus can make all things new. He will restore what his people have lost, and he will give them greater joy than any brokenness we have experienced. Paul talks about this in Romans 8, verse 18. He says this, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed in us." That's who God is. That's how Jesus fulfills these commandments. So we see that he is a God of liberation. He's a God of life, a God of restoration, but he's also a God of holiness. Let's look at chapter 22, verses 16 to 20. "If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed, then lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuse to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction." We see in this section God provide laws that instruct his people in holy living. These are laws concerning sexual immorality in some cases. And as we talk about sexual immorality, it's people don't like it. They don't like when you get up in their business. I think it is viewed as, and is rightly so, one of the more personal aspects of people's lives that we keep private, that we often feel quite a bit of authority and control over. And so people don't like it when you talk about God's impositions into the areas of your life that you want to keep to yourself. But God calls us to worship and obey him with our entire lives. With our entire lives. Every area of our life is to be given over to God. And so he gives laws that promote sexual morality among his people. He says that if there are single people sleeping together, they should get married. This is an extension of the prohibition of adultery that we saw in the Ten Commandments. You see, your sex life matters to God because your whole life belongs to him. Every aspect of your life, even the personal and private ones, belong to God and should reflect his character in how you live. So he gives these laws concerning sexual immorality. He gives these laws also concerning idol worship. He condemns this practice of sorcery and some other things in there that were often associated with the worship of idols, that other nations surrounding people groups would use as their practice of worshiping false gods. And God prohibits these acts because he is not like those other gods. He is holy. He is different from them, and he will not tolerate sinful worship. And so he's instructing his people to treat him as holy. The entirety of their lives should be a reflection of his holiness. Because he is holy. It is unfitting for his people to worship false idols and live sinful lives. Their lives should reflect his holiness. Their worship should be holy. The world should be able to look at them and see that they are different. And Jesus is the fulfillment of these laws. He is perfect in holiness. He never sinned. He loved God with his whole heart. He always loved his neighbor as himself. And not only that, he died to make us holy. He offered himself as a perfect sacrifice. His worship of God was never contaminated nor compromised. And by his death, he sanctifies us. He makes us holy. All who come to him in faith are made holy through faith in Jesus by his blood. So we should worship God in holiness. We should let our lives reflect his character. Next, we see that he is the God of the oppressed. This covers chapter 22, verses 17 to 23, 9. I'm just going to read 23, 6 to 9. You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and the righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. You shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Here in this section, we see God provide laws that protect the poor and the immigrant. He establishes these laws to prevent the oppression of the marginalized, of the people in their community who were most likely to be taken advantage of. That word there, sojourners, is another word for immigrants. They were people who did not come from the land but had moved there. He also talks about the poor. He talks about widows and orphans in this section. And then he prohibits giving false testimony or taking bribe or lending at interest in a way that's exploitative or manipulative. See, these laws were designed to protect those who could not protect themselves. Those in their community who were unable to advocate for themselves. A great example is widows and orphans. This was a patriarchal society without a father or husband to advocate for them. They were easy to take advantage of. And God said, this will not be how my people conduct themselves. The same was true for immigrants. They were an easy target for oppression. We see that today. We hear stories often of migratory workers who move from one country to another to get this job they heard about. And when they get there, they find out the job's not as good as they thought it was, and they might not actually be able to leave until they make some money. They're often caught in these exploitative labor practices where they cannot go home, they cannot work somewhere else, and are forced into near slavery for an oppressive employer. It's easy to take advantage of people when they don't speak the language or know their neighbors. And God said, this is not what will happen with my community. He demanded better from his people. And these commands were actually rooted in their own history, because the Israelites were sojourners, they were immigrants in Egypt when they were oppressed, when they were forced into slavery. And they watched as the Egyptians faced judgment, as God heard their cries. And so God says, don't do what I rescued you from. You will be different, because God is an advocate for the oppressed. That is his character. He actually makes it very explicit in chapter 22, verses 22 to 24. He says, you shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn. And I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. See, God hears the cries of the oppressed, and he avenges them. This is the same language from Exodus chapter 1 when it talks about the cries of the Israelites going up to God and God hearing their cries. He says, if you treat people like you were treated, I will hear their cries, and this time my wrath will come to you. God advocates for the poor, the widow, the immigrant, and he will not tolerate their mistreatment. This is one of the most common condemnations in the prophets, in those books of the Bible. They are often calling out the way that the rich and powerful are treating the poor in their community, or neglecting the widows and the orphans in their community. And it's interesting that there are all these commands God gives, but this is the one where he specifies how his wrath will come if you fail to keep it. It seems to touch quite closely on his heart for the poor, for the marginalized. And as in the other cases, Jesus is the fulfillment of these commandments. He is the ultimate advocate for the marginalized. It's because of him that the poor and the meek can be called blessed. He is the promised king who will bring peace and justice to the world. In Luke chapter 4, Jesus is reading in front of a crowd, and he reads a quote from the prophet Isaiah. It's this, Luke 4, 18 to 19. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. He then states that this prophecy is fulfilled through him. He is the fulfillment of the law. He brings liberty to the captives. He has broken the power of death. He is the one who will make all things new. So what's the point? I would say the point of this message is that we should lead lives that reflect the character of God. It's that simple. We should live in a way that looks like God, that is reflecting his character, his loves, his convictions. And reading through these verses, there are 1,000 different applications specific that I could give out. We could be here for another however long I've been talking about all these applications. But I think I want to focus just on one for tonight, maybe two. I think that we need to be advocates for those who can't advocate for themselves, for the marginalized, for the widow, for the orphan. We need to make sure that our lives are defined by caring for those who cannot care for themselves, protecting those in our community who cannot protect themselves. We need to intercede for our community where we can. God hears the cries of the widows and the orphans, so we can't ignore them. And I don't have a one-size-fits-all. We're all different people with different gifts and different time and different responsibilities. But you can think about something like foster care or mentoring or giving to causes that can help in these ways. You should look for ways to care for those who cannot care for themselves. Look for ways to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Reflect God's character by being a person for the oppressed, like he is a God of the oppressed. But the other way that I think we need to respond to this passage is by hoping in Jesus who fulfills the law of Moses. When we read these rules that can seem so strange, so alien to us, we need to remember that Christ is the fulfillment of these laws, and so we should look to him for hope. There is no person or community that has perfectly kept God's laws. There is no society that does not have the corruption of sin. We need to fix our hope on Jesus, who will return and bring justice and peace.